Good morning, guys. Hey, zero is starting to feel kind of normal, isn't it? No big deal. You know? Well, we're going to dive into our series again called Move, a Doer's Guide to Maturity, because that's what James is teaching us in this little letter that he's writing. Remember that James is the brother of Jesus, and James claims no particular status. You know, you could think, okay, James, give us the inside scoop. How was Jesus at algebra? You know, was he really a great wide receiver? You know, tell us about what happened in your home. James doesn't claim any special status, any insider information. James was not a believer, probably until the resurrection. And then he became a leader in the church in Jerusalem, the mother church of all churches. We trace our lineage back to that Jerusalem gathering of believers in the temple courts. So let's dive right into James. You have it right in your notes there, but let's read James chapter 1, verses 1 through 8. James, a servant of God and of the Lord Jesus Christ, to the 12 tribes in the dispersion. Greetings. Count it all joy, my brothers, when you meet trials of various kinds. For you know that the testing of your faith produces steadfastness, and let steadfastness have its full effect, that you may be perfect and complete, lacking nothing. If any of you lacks wisdom, let him ask God, who gives generously to all without reproach, and it will be given to him. But let him ask in faith with no doubting, for the one who doubts is like the wave of the sea that is driven and tossed by the wind. For that person must not suppose that he will receive anything from the Lord. He is a double-minded man, unstable in all his ways. Notice that James places himself at the foot of the cross. He says, James, a servant of God and of the Lord, Jesus, his brother, who is Christ the Messiah. And James is going to walk us through how to move, how to put into action our faith. That's the theme of this whole book. You know, faith without what? Works is dead. But that's not all there is to this book. But so before he does that, he's going to make sure before we get our hands and feet, before we go start packing meals that feed my starving children and feel good about our expression of faith, which we ought to, but first he's going to tune up our hearts and our minds. And he starts right out with a lump of oatmeal here for breakfast. Because he says, count it all joy, my brothers, when you meet trials of various kinds. You know, people tend toward imbalance. We go from one extreme to the other. And we can do that spiritually as well. We could easily do that in the book of James. We could easily think, well, this is all about checklists. It's all about what have I done today? How have I performed today? Did I really show my faith in some demonstrable way today? And maybe the question is not wrong, but the accusation that can come, the shaming and the performance mentality that can come if we are imbalanced in that way is not what James wants. Nor is it right to say, well, I feel peaceful with God and let the world go by. We need to have balance in our life. So I want you to do a little exercise. Would you stand with me? Stand up. Without touching anything, I want you to stand on one foot. Can you do it? Yeah. Now touch your nose. No, you may be seated. You are all under arrest. Now, the reason I do that is to help us remember a lesson. You never achieve balance. You never achieve balance. You pass through it, and you notice that you need to go the other way. Your ankle is constantly making adjustments. This ballast out here in your hands, you automatically put your hands out because you know I can't just stand stationary and static. And the balance of the Christian life is not that you achieve this balance and you walk this perfect line without wavering. It's that you start to notice, I'm leaning away from people and I'm not expressing my faith. Or I'm leaning so much toward works that I need to get back to my heart with Jesus. It's going to be a constant balance. And a lot of it depends on your temperament. A lot of it depends on your gifting. But that's what James is all about. It's about balancing not only your heart and mind, but your hands and feet, and making sure that you notice when you've begun to neglect one side or the other, and you correct. And as you're around more mature people, you recognize that their corrective mechanism is quicker. When you're sometimes around people in a lot of trouble or people who are more immature, you realize they spend a lot of time falling off one side or the other. And so anyway, that's our goal, is to achieve this kind of balance. And James will help us to do that. He's going to ask us to balance things like this: hardship and joy, that's this morning. Or faith and practice. Or hearing and doing. Humility and pride. Patience and planning. Prayer and power. Those things are on opposite ends of the spectrum, and James is going to say we need to balance these things in our spiritual life. Well, what 3 words hop out at you on this passage? I'd say 3 of them. Number 1, trials. Oh, come on, James. Trials. Second word is various. Various trials. And the third word that sticks out in this passage is when. Not if. When. James is not saying, listen, my dear children, now that you believed in Jesus, your problems are over. You're going to have your best life now. So jump into the hot tub, take a seat at the banquet table, hop into your Ferrari. Your house is going to look like the makeover channel. Everything's going to work out. There's going to be no potholes in your life. No, James says, listen, I'm writing to the tribes in dispersion, and I'm telling you when you experience various trials. And the beauty of this is that we know from the exercise we just did that balance is only achieved when you're moving. We know that's true on a bicycle. We also know it's true just in life. But when we're moving toward something, when we move, when we're in action, when we have a goal, when we have a purpose, we have a horizon toward which we're moving, God helps us find the balance that we need. So I want to give you 3 A's today. This is all A's, so straight A's. First of all is this: to adopt an attitude. The first move is to adopt an attitude. Before we engage our hands and our feet, we need to tune our hearts and our minds with an attitude. And here's the attitude check in 2 Corinthians 10:4. For the weapons of our warfare are not of the flesh, but have divine power to destroy strongholds. Now this comes from another part of Scripture, but obviously this is harmonious with what James is talking about. And what it's saying is when we meet trials, we're going to have to jettison some of the swords and spears and hand grenades and weapons that we're accustomed to fighting with, and take on a whole new array of both offensive and defensive weapons. What are the weapons that we tend to fight with? Well, it's anger, force, resentment, vengeance, despair, hatred, envy. Just look at the whole snarly list of the works of the flesh. That's what we've practiced before we came to Christ, and Jesus is saying, and James is saying, now when you meet trials, I want you to fight. It needs to be, and here's the attitude, it's joy attitude than what you are accustomed to. So there needs to be, and here's the attitude, it's joy in trials. And there's an endless variety of trials right in this room. Think of a trial that you're under. It may be a pressure, a deadline, that you need to complete. It may be a relationship that's become sore and abrasive. You know you need to walk into it. You know something needs to be done there. You've been avoiding it. It may be a disappointment. Maybe it's a rejection. Perhaps it's an abuse that's in the past. But there's a trial in your life. It may be a physical ailment, and don't tell me about it. I'll pray about it for you. All right? I just want you to think of a trial. You know a trial is something you want to avoid. So what are you avoiding? Just put that in your mind. And James says, I want you to have an attitude of joy toward this trial. Well, that takes a whole new mindset. It's a mindset of challenge. It's a mindset of, I'm going to walk into this fire because I know beneath my surface happiness, which isn't right there right now, I can go into this knowing with an expectancy that God is going to work through me and in me and for me in this trial. I love this challenge that Ernest Shackleton gave in 1913 when he was launching the Trans-Antarctic expedition to march across the whole expanse of the continent of Antarctica. I think it's 2,000 miles all the way across. And here's what he put in the newspaper. Men wanted for hazardous journey, low wages, bitter cold, long hours of complete darkness, safe return doubtful. Lars signed up, I'm sure. Honor and recognition in event of success. Now, you would think that would repel people like crazy, but hundreds of men said, I want to go. I want that. Well, you might not be able to march across Antarctica, but you have perhaps a cold, dark, scary challenge in your trial. And God is saying, James is saying, consider it joy. Look at that word, consider, count. That's a willful change of mind. Instead of being fearful and avoidant, I'm going to count it, consider it joy. And the attitude is a mindset because it says, for we know. That's what follows up on it. I really can't have joy if I'm waiting for a feeling of happiness about my trials. I can have joy only in the fact that I know that God is here. He hasn't left the room. He hasn't abandoned me. He knows exactly what I'm going through, and He will walk through it with me. So I can have a deeper satisfaction than a surface happiness. I can have an attitude of joy in my heart. And when the investments are tanking, or when you're lying in the MRI tunnel, or you've been disappointed, plans have been changed, delays have been put in your life, count it joy. Listen to Charles Spurgeon, not only a great preacher, but really, for his day and age, he was incredibly transparent. He says, I have looked back to times of trial with a kind of longing. And I've heard this testimony dozens of times. Not to have them return, but to feel the strength of God as I have felt it then. To feel the power of faith as I have felt it then. To hang upon God's powerful arm as I hung upon it then. And to see God at work as I saw Him then. You know that. You look back on the trials, and when you were flat, busted, on your face, in your sweat and your snot, crying out to God, you were so close to Him in your trial. And so now the new trial, keep your history with you. Remember, nobody wants the trial. Nobody wants to hurt. But adopt an attitude that says, I know. I'm going to count it joy because I know. And this is what James is saying. We've got to prepare our minds because, when we do go into action, when we do start giving out to people, we're going to get some blowback. I heard a story this week about someone who they came to a food shelf and they gave this person all this food, and the person sat down on the floor and inspected the bag and said, well, where's this and where's that, and how come I didn't get that? They tried to do an act of love, and they got inspected and basically rejected. So when we go out there to do these things, we're going to get the blowback, but James is preparing our hearts also. Prepare for your own trial. Second thing is this. Don't you like all these A's? This will be so easy for you to remember. Aspire to an attribute. What's the purpose of all this? These tests are not purposeless. The attribute that we want to aspire to is called steadfastness. Steadfastness is another word for perseverance. And I can guarantee you this, if you need perseverance, you don't want it. What you want is an answer. What you want is victory. What you want is clarity. But joy in trials brings steadfastness, because even when we don't know what the outcome will be, we know who's walking with us. And so we keep walking forward. William Barclay, a New Testament commentator, said this is what the word means. Steadfastness is not a patience which sits down and bows its head and passively endures until the storm is past. It is a spirit which can bear up under things, not simply with resignation, but with blazing hope, knowing what it will produce. It's bearing up under a heavy load. It's purposely lifting the weight and saying, I won't quit. Can we say this? It's a holy stubbornness. I'm not going to quit on that relationship. I'm not going to quit on my discipleship. I'm not going to quit on that hard situation. And wouldn't all of us like to, we'll not hear it in our own epitaph, we won't hear it in our own eulogy, but don't you want your sons and daughters to say, you know, there was one thing about my dad. He wouldn't quit. He was steadfast. He kept going. You've heard this story before about the ship Vasa. It's in the Stockholm Museum. In 1628, the king of Sweden built the world's greatest warship. And he festooned it with all kinds of sculptures. And it's like 4 stories high. It's huge. And he wanted to impress the king of Germany with how great Sweden was, Lars. And so he doubled the number of cannon, which meant he doubled the cannon ports. So when they launched the ship in the harbor of Stockholm, they put it in full sail and it sailed out, and they had all the gun ports open to show off how much armor they had on board. A gust of wind caught, it listed over, and the gun ports filled with water, and the ship sank on its maiden voyage. And part of the reason is that they had not yet completed filling it with ballast. So when the wind blew, there was no counterbalance to that. And obviously they've resurrected it, but it was perfectly preserved in the cold water. But what an example that is. Steadfastness is the ballast in your life. You're going to face wind. You're going to feel like, man, I don't like sailing at this angle. I don't like what the wind is doing to me, but the ballast of steadfastness, counting it joy and walking in an attitude of joy and having steadfastness in our life, is the ballast that we need. And that's not the end, because ballast is made so that we can sail on. And what it says is, let steadfastness have its full effect. There's testing, which brings steadfastness. Steadfastness brings completion. That doesn't mean perfection. It simply means maturity. And maturity says that you're lacking nothing. It doesn't mean you have it all right now. It just means you have access to everything you need. So it's not just a white-knuckle perseverance leading nowhere. Steadfastness leads us to maturity and a sense that God is with me in all the circumstances. Well, thirdly, is to ask for assistance. So we want to adopt an attitude. We want to aspire to an attribute that people would know us as a man who is steady as she goes. And thirdly, we need to ask for assistance. And this is what it says: if anyone lacks wisdom, he just said you would lack nothing. And now he says, but if you lack wisdom. So in other words, he's not saying you possess everything that you need, but you're in Home Depot. Ask where you can find it. You know what that's like. And this is often quoted, completely out of context. Remember that this wisdom is found in the midst of your trial, when you need it the most. Ask God, who gives generously without reproach. There's no shame in asking the question. When I was a boy, I was very shy, and I never asked a question in class. Because I felt like if I asked a question, that proved that I wasn't paying attention. So I always waited for Fred to ask the questions. And I would surf on the answer that he got. And I'm still learning. Would you just ask? When you come up short, you don't know what to do, you've tried a few options and they haven't worked, don't be proud, don't be stubborn, don't be cussed, don't be isolated. Ask, and God will give you His timely wisdom. When I was about 14, I bought a Vespa motor scooter for $25. It was an old beat-up thing, and I rode that thing thousands of miles, but I'd be flying along at 40 miles an hour on my Vespa with no helmet. It hadn't been invented then, I don't think. And all of a sudden it would die. And I found out the problem was that a carbon arc would form on the points of the spark plug, and so it wouldn't spark. Well, I got so good at fixing that, I could do that in like 3 minutes. I'd whip that spark plug out, scrape it off, throw it back in, and off I'd go. But I kept, every 20 miles or so, this thing would do that, and especially when I was trying to go faster. And finally, I asked the guy at the gas station, why does this do this? And he said, well, what kind of oil are you using? I go, well, oil. You mix the gas and the oil. He goes, you need to use non-detergent oil. Now it's called two-cycle oil. But he said, you need to use non-detergent oil. And you go, solve the problem. How many times have we been in that situation? We're struggling with something, and someone comes along and makes child's play out of this mystery. Now, it doesn't always happen that way, but it happens in medicine, it happens in home improvement, it happens in mechanics, it happens in IT, it happens all around. If I had only asked, I would have saved myself so much stress and pain and probably not wounded some people around me in my desperation, if I would just ask. I want to read you this little story I just read this week. It's by Michael Card, the musician, who's written a book called Inexpressible. It's about the Hesed, this is a Hebrew word, the Hesed love of God. He says, what we thought would be a routine procedure dragged out to 3 days in the hospital. The surgeon was amazingly kind, as were the nurses who meticulously cared for us. On the second day, when I began to realize that we might have a longer day ahead, I went down to the store for some possibles that we would need. When I filed into the checkout line, there was a woman ahead of me with as many items in her hands as I had. She smiled at me and she said, why don't you go ahead of me? Little did she know the minefield that she had just stepped into. Oh, I couldn't do that, I said. My mother didn't raise me to break into the line. And what's more, she always taught me to let girls go first. I said jokingly, but also kind of serious. She patiently smiled, but insisted again that I go ahead. She said, I have some questions and I don't want you to have to wait for me. But I'd be glad to wait, I said, still trying to be considerate, kind, my mother's son, and so on. And then she said something that suddenly brought tears to my eyes. There are tears in my eyes at this moment as I write these words, though I'm not sure completely I understand why. She said, "Why won't you let me be kind to you?" Why wouldn't I? In my mind, apparently kindness counted only when I did it for someone else. In that small encounter, I learned a new lesson. If you truly love, Hesed love, as Micah 6 verse 8 says, you should love having it shown to you as much as showing it to others. As Paul says, it's the pathway, and it can be traveled in more than one direction. That's convicting. The Lord says, ask me. And he says, ask and don't doubt. And often we get wrapped around the axle of that. We go, well, I'm going to ask for this new job. Oh, but I just had a doubt. Oh, so he's not going to answer it. I'm going to ask to be healed. Oh, but I just had a question of, he's not going to. It says, ask without doubting or you won't get anything. Is that what it means? That you are, once you ask, you have to be absolutely North Star focused and never have a question or a doubt, or God isn't going to answer your prayer. You see, we're praying about the outcome instead of praying to the author. Don't doubt the author. Don't go looking for someone else. You may not get exactly what you ask for. That's not the kind of doubting he's talking about. He's talking about if you're going to ask, if you're going to come to me and ask me. Don't go to a second opinion. Don't go to another idol. Don't jump to your old nature. Don't use the weapons you used to use. Come and ask the author. So this key thing, my faith is not in the outcome, but in the author. Don't doubt him. So this is what James is doing for us today. He's moving us from doubt to wisdom. And it comes through trials, it comes through tests, it comes through all kinds of things, but it's also shaping us, making us steadfast so that we don't quit. We stay at it. And our epitaph will read, faithful. So James is setting our hearts and minds before we get into some more of the doing that he's going to take us into. So you've got some questions I'd love to have you talk about. Wish I could be a fly on the wall and hear your answers, but share with one another because this is how we grow. Let's apply it.